Welcome back. Now that we have a nice sign-in authentication function, it's time for us to generate the JWT token and actually send it to the user. So we can start using it and you can see how JWT tokens work. Now, ideally, what we want to do is something like this. Instead of returning just the data object, that is the user object, with ID, email, name, and other fields that the database may have, let's add another logic here. I'm going to say that in here, we want to check something first. Well, first we want to check that we have data.id from whatever the response was, just to make sure that we indeed have the user that we need, or the database returns something that we can use. And let's just add another check data.email, and we can do other checks here, but this should be enough to verify that this data is in fact the user. And we'll do a ternary operator. I'm going to say if this exists, then I want you to respond with the user data. Or if it doesn't, once again, we can just use a promise.reject. These are really, really useful functions to use. And for now, just to simplify things, we're going to respond with whatever data we received. You might actually want to return a string response here that doesn't give away too much information, because right now we would be potentially sending data to the front end from the database, which we don't really want to do. But for debugging purposes, it's nice to have now, because if somehow something fails, I can see, all right, what am I getting rejections with? And hopefully help us debug better. Now, within here, I like naming things nice and clean. And in our case, instead of just responding with the data, we want to do something where we create a user session. So I'm going to change this to a function that we're going to create called create sessions. And this create sessions is going to receive the data object. And this data object, which hopefully is a user, will be used in create sessions, and the create sessions is going to return a promise that includes all the user information that we need, plus the token, the new token that we're going to generate. So let's create this function. I'm going to say const create sessions, which is going to receive data, or let's just say user for now. And this function is now going to create our session for the user. Now in here, we want to create the JWT token and return user data, let's say. And in order for us to create a JWT token, we need to install the JWT package from, as you know, npm. If we go over here, this is the package we're going to use. We simply run npm install JSON Web Token, and they have nice, simple documentation for us to use. And you can see that we can just create a token, but by running this command. Nice and simple. So let's do that. I'm going to run npm install. I'm going to close our container for now and run the install for JSON Web Token. And that was nice and quick. Now, once we have that, if we scroll down, we simply require it and then sign the token. I'm going to copy this. Let's go all the way up here. I'm going to require the token. I'm going to use const here. All right, so we have the JWT object now that we can use to create a token. And in here, let's create a function called sign token. Now, in the create session, I'm going to grab the user or email and ID, which again, we check for over here. So we make sure that we have data ID, data email from the parameter user that we receive. And we want to create a token that is going to be the sign token. But again, I would like keeping things simple and function small. So I'm going to create a new function called sign token. And this sign token is going to receive the let's say, email of the user to use in order to sign the token. All right, let's create a new function, const sign token. And again, making functions nice and small means that, well, we can test them easier. When we actually write tests, it's going to be simpler because, well, they're nice small chunks that we can unit test. All right, and this sign token function is going to receive the email. And let's just have a JWT payload that we're going to use. And this JWT payload is going to have the email. Now, payload is just, if you look at the documentation, this is just common naming. If you see over here, we can sign the token with some sort of data. Because remember, JWT tokens actually hold data. When you decode it, you can actually find out what object it contains. And I said that we don't really want sensitive information in a JWT token. In our case, email is fine. You might want to use ID, but something that might be useful for you if you want to decode this token and use it later on. For us, let's just keep the email as the payload of JWT so that we sign a token with the user's email. And we can simply just return here and finally sign our token. So I'm just copying from whatever the documentation said. We want to use JWT sign. And this payload is going to be the payload that we just created. And here you want a secret in order to sign this. Again, something very, very important that you don't want people to know. And as soon as I said that, something should go blink in your head. And that means, well, that's a very, very secure thing that we should probably have an environmental variable for. For now, though, remember, with environmental variables, you'll have to do process.env. Let's say JWT secret or something like that. But because we've already gone through that and we already know how to do it, I'm just going to keep it simple and say JWT secret. And we're going to sign it with that. And by the way, with JWT, you can do some interesting things. For example, you can give it options, such as expires in. And we can give it how many days or seconds JWT token expires in, which is a really nice feature. So let's just say 2 days for now, just for fun. Even though with JWT, you can do this, one of the main drawbacks with them is that when it comes to users signing out, it's kind of hard to revoke these tokens. And there are ways around it, but by using Redis and our method of sessions, it's going to become really, really easy to actually remove the token anytime the user signs up. But anyway, for now, let's leave it like that. We're just returning a JWT token now. We're just signing the token. And now we have a token in create sessions. Nice and simple. Now let me save this and run my Docker container again. We just run docker compose up. It's already been built, so we don't need the -- build. All right, looks like there's no errors. That's always a good sign. Let's come back here. We see that we're signing the token. And now the next thing we want to do is do something with this token. To start off, let's just return this token to the front end so we can actually see that we actually receive a JWT token. I'm going to simply say return. Well, what should we return here? Remember, we don't really want to do a response.json because we want to keep all those responses to sign-in authentication. We see that here we're returning, or we want to return, the create sessions or a promise.reject. In our case, ideally, no matter what, in here, we want to have a .then that has a response. So let's do a response.json, or let's actually return the session if we receive the session from create session. And we're going to simply say response.json and just return whatever the session is. And whatever the session is whatever we return from this create session function, this one. For now, because we're going to be sending JSON, let's just say that we want success to be true, and we'll give, let's say, user ID to be the ID that we received from the user, from the database, and also give the token, just like that. And just to make this nice and concise, again, because it's the key is equal to the value, I can just leave it at token. So now we're sending back a token and our user ID. Now, this user object, if you remember, usually we return the entire thing and would have the profile information such as email, name, so that right away as we sign in, we get that information. Now, here's the thing that we're going to do. Because up until now, when a user signed in, we would run the handle sign-in function and just return the user object. But there's a nicer, cleaner way of doing this. You want to keep your endpoints really descriptive. And you want to make sure that sign-in just handles the sign-in. It's either true or false. Are you signed in? Are you not signed in? Are you authenticated? Are you not authenticated? And ideally, we use something like get profile ID to actually get the user's information. Again, we're just being very descriptive, similar with how we do pure functions. We're just making sure that each endpoint does one thing and one thing really well. And that's a nicer design to have because it makes more sense and it's a lot cleaner. And as you extend things, it's easier to understand. And when a new developer comes on, they'll be able to say, okay, well, this is what we're probably using to get the profile. This is probably what we're using to sign in. It might be surprising to some to see that, we're returning an entire user object with the sign-in endpoint. So just to keep things clean and rational in our heads, I'm going to only return the ID. And then on the front end, actually do a GET request to the profile. And because we have the user ID now, we can just request that profile information. Let's test this out. I'm going to save and go back to my app. I'm going to sign out. Let's do a@a.com. I'm going to open up the developer tools, go to network tab, make sure everything's cleared, and click sign in. All right, looks like we were not able to sign in. If I click on the sign in, oh, look at that. I have success, true. User ID is 1. And we have ourselves a token. Fantastic. So this is our token that now authenticates us. And we make sure that now the server can identify this browser, this client, as, well, user ID 1. Very, very cool. But why were we not able to log in? Well, this is something that you have to be careful of every time you change whatever the expected return is. Up until this point, we had handle sign-in do a certain thing, and that is return the entire user object. As soon as we change something on the backend to return something that the client didn't know the change happened, we might break things. And we want to be conscious of that anytime you return something different than what the client expects and what the front-end developers expect, that you make sure that you adjust for this. So if we go back to our front-end code, let's go to our sign-in component. I believe that's where we do the sign-in. And we see over here that as we scroll down on submit sign-in, we do the sign-in endpoint with the post. We send the email and the password. And then finally here, when we get a response, we do a check saying user.id. And then we load the user and do the route change. But we actually don't have user.id anymore, do we? Because what we return is actually an object with success, true, user ID, and a token. So we now have to change this front end to perhaps say that this is going to be data. And this data is going to contain a user ID. And if that matches, then we want to load up the user, which right now we actually don't have. So I'm going to leave that the way we have it for now. It might not load any of the users because There's no user object. I'm going to change it to data for now. And this might fail, and it's something we'll come back to because we might want to do a GET request now to profile ID with the ID that we have. So let me just save that, go back. Let's sign in again. I'm going to close this, a@a.com, sign in. All right, we're logged into our app. We have our authentication token now, but we have a problem. We have undefined. That is, there's no username because we've only returned the ID. And we've only returned the ID, as I mentioned, because we want to use the ID to actually get the user profile. And the reason we want to do this is because we know that anything to do with the profile, we want to make sure these are guarded endpoints. That is, not everybody can just access them. Only authenticated users that have tokens can access it based on what tokens they have. All right, in the next video, we're going to add on to this and make sure that our authentication system is working nicely. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.